Yeah, at least speak in.
Yeah. Well, he should be able to. It just maybe we get a little echo.
Okay. Are you ready? Okay, so I'm going to call to order the subcommittee meeting for the Testing and Accountability Subcommittee. I'm Bob Eby, the Vice Chair of the State Board of Education. And with us we have on our subcommittee Nick Darnell, who is here, and Daryl Cobbins, who is dialed in by phone. We also have two other board members present. Mike Edwards is here at the meeting, and Lillian Hartgrove, our chair, is on the phone. And before we get started, I'd like to first say a happy birthday to our chair, to Lillian Hartgrove, and wish you the best and enjoy your day, and happy birthday, Lillian. We have a full meeting today, and we're pleased to have with us from the Department of Education, Casey Hagner-Wren and Mike Hardy, and they're going to be talking about assessment updates and end-of-course exams for chemistry and English, as well as accountability. And with that, I'll turn it over to our Executive Director, Dr. Sarah Morrison, to see if she has any words to say.
Thank you, Bob. No, I don't have too much to say other than I'm also appreciative of our board members and our colleagues at the department joining us. We're eager to dive in and understand a little bit more about the plans for transitioning to a new vendor this spring with our assessment, and some questions I know Mike Edwards has brought to the board in the past around a couple particular EOCs. And then glad to have Mike here as well, Mike Hardy, to talk about the accountability systems. Is something that we got into sort of initial conversations at a recent board meeting, but weren't able to dive quite as deeply into. So just glad to have the time and the expertise in the room that we can spend a little bit more in-depth conversation on both of these topics. So look forward to the conversation. And thanks to Daryl and Lillian for joining us via conference call.
And I will say this, is that I think the board members did receive last night copies of the slides. I may ask you to go through them slowly because I actually haven't had a lot of time to go through, and I do have some questions, but we will turn it over. I think Casey's going to speak first on assessment updates.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the time to give you a brief overview and updates today. And thank you to Amy for advancing our slides so we can be here together in this more intimate setting today. I will give you some updates on the results that we saw from our fall assessments, and in thinking about spring and our full transition to Pearson through this school year, what that looks like. So we'll do a review of our fall 2019 window, and then in preparation for spring. And then we'll spend a little bit of time looking ahead, and so talking about what we're doing right now to develop quality items and exams. A brief update on where we are thinking for the return to online assessment. As you all know, we have been fully papered this year. And then to dig into some of those questions that I know board members have raised around the specific topics that we assess right now. So just to start, to kick off, and Amy, if you can give us a couple of slides here in the review of fall testing by the numbers. And so these numbers are real. One of the things that we worked very hard with Pearson on this year was having up-to-date, in-the-moment access to their operations numbers and dashboards, so I could see in real time what was being printed, what was being shipped, what was being sealed, what had been received back from our districts. When we're talking about testing on in paper, it is so important that we are actually sending and receiving those secure testing documents, and that we're accounting for every single one of those documents. And so we did a lot of work with Pearson to say this is where we need real-time visibility. That's also important as we're thinking about the timeliness of returning these documents in order to hit our pretty aggressive score returns dates that we have promised to districts. And so this is what the fall administration looked like. For fall, we test on our end-of-course exams only, and that's to accommodate high schools that are on block schedules who finish a full course in one semester. And so this is what that looked like in December this year. Over 134,000 secure test materials were printed by Pearson and over 300,000 seals. So if you think about, breaking the sticker to open that test booklet, over 300,000 of those stickers were applied by hand by Pearson to make sure that our test booklets were exactly what we wanted. And we actually heard from the field, these are look incredible. They're very well organized, well boxed, and folks felt very good about the materials that they received from Pearson this fall. Those materials came in over 3,000 boxes that were shipped to 73 districts to fill over 800 orders. Some of these orders were shipped freight, so our big districts like Knox, Mike, you'll be happy to hear that they received freight shipments and then that were well organized, that they've been distributed to schools and districts after that. We saw 66,000 students take more than 86,000 tests. And the number on this slide that I am most proud of is during that 14-day administration window that spanned basically 3 weeks, we had absolutely no calls to our urgent solutions line and absolutely no tips submitted to our anonymous security tip line. So we had very few calls during that time that were to our kind of customer support that were non-urgent things. How do I ship this back? How do I put this label on? But in terms of like urgent in the moment needs, we did not have those. The department hosted that solutions line. We were on the phone, our staff, IT staff, Pearson staff were on the phone in an open call line every single day, all day that we did tests, and no one called in. We had daily webinars where we addressed non-urgent questions, and more than 70% of districts who were testing with us participated at one point in some of those webinars. So a very smooth administration, and meeting with directors of schools in their last meeting at the end of December, they were very pleased with how smooth the administration had run and how responsive Pearson had been. And so, Amy, on the next slide.
Before you go that,
yeah.
I hope you don't mind if we just interrupt you as we're going.
Sure, please.
So, I mean, 66,000 unique students, 86,000 tests taken. Did some students take different tests, or did
Yes.
they take the same test twice?
Yep.
Or how do they decide that?
If you think about a student who's in 10th grade, they might take Algebra 2 and English 2. And so there could be multiple content exams that they are taking. Other questions on this slide? So the next slide, these are actual comments from district personnel that called in asking questions of Pearson. One of the questions that we got from the board is how is this transition going? This was a very fast transition over the summer to get Pearson up to speed and then to deploy and administer tests within a matter of months. And I will say that I've been very impressed with how responsive they have been. And you can see here actual quotes from school and district personnel who have called in with questions to Pearson, how quickly those questions have been resolved. And how happy folks are with the customer service. Our service levels, I am monitoring those customer service calls and service levels on a weekly basis. And when we see maybe calls are taking a little bit longer than we expect, et cetera, we go in and we address that with additional training. And so again, I've been really pleased. Our service level is over 90% right now, which means calls are answered within seconds. They're resolved within minutes. I think our average right now is below 15 minutes. Folks are on the call, off the call. They're getting their questions answered and resolved. So we're very pleased with the district support that is being provided, not just by our team, but by our partners at Pearson as well. Amy? So this is where we are right now with fall is in the scoring and reporting of the actual student results. The scanning of scorable documents, so the bubble sheets and our handwritten essays, the scanning actually started several days ahead of schedule. We had some districts that shipped back the materials early, and Pearson got right on it and started processing those materials. In fact, they produced our first state data files 2 days ahead of schedule that allowed our team more time to do an in-depth review of those data files. And then right raw scores were delivered to districts, not at the end of the day that we promised them, but actually at 9 a.m. On the day that we promised. So districts were really excited to log in that first thing Monday morning after break and be able to see those scores. Right now, we're currently on track for producing all of the individual student score reports and the individual district and school data files that will be delivered to districts at the end of the month. In conjunction with that delivery of reports, this is the first year ever that we're actually going to be opening up both an educator online portal and a family portal. And so instead of just handing a student a paper score report, parents can now log on using their student's ID and an email and see their students' results on this portal. And we hope that this becomes more robust after the first iteration, that we actually have a live survey on the portal, and we're working with Pearson to do some focus groups with parents to get feedback on how this looks. And then we'll be making enhancements as we plan for the spring release and then next year. So we're really excited about this. As a mom who now has kids in public school, and the successes and the challenges that I've found with getting access to certain information, that's definitely has colored my lens of how easy we want this to be for parents. And then that same thing goes for educators. You know, assessment data, the quicker that we get it in the hands of our instructors, the more impactful that it can be. So we are really excited about the launch of these two portals.
This is, I think this is a game changer. I think it's something that we've needed for a long time. You know, and as a teacher trying to get into the portal and look, sometimes it's a little complicated. You have to go to several different sites to look at different things. Could you share, you know, what is kind of the vision of what would be in the family portal? What types of reports would be there? Versus what would the teacher portal look like? What would be included in that one?
The family portal is going to look a whole lot like your score report. There's going to be a basic overall score. You're going to have sub-score information, so reporting on how your student is doing in specific standards or different content area in a given exam. There's going to be next steps that are tailored to each student based on their scores and where they showed strength and areas for improvement in the actual test based on that sub-score. You'll also see some basic information about you know, where the state averages are, the district and school, so you can see not just the progress of your student, but what that looks like in context. And then there's links to resources. So once they have an understanding of this is where my student is doing how my student is doing right now, these are my students' areas of strength and areas of growth. There's specific next steps that I can then tackle that are based on my students' results, and then there's resources. So if I have questions about the standards or about how to interpret this information, then it links to department resources for those things as well. On the educator portal, there is a lot more in-depth information that is similar to information we've shared in the past, but instead of just sharing a file and hoping you know, that folks have the Excel skills to sort or break that down, we're actually putting a lot of that functionality in the portal. So if you have a specific question, maybe I'm a principal, I've put in place a new math tutoring program, I want to actually go in and see what are the scores of students who fall in a specific grade band with specific characteristics. I can go and do that in real time and get those reports. So it's a much more user-friendly portal than just receiving the information and manipulating it themselves.
If you're a teacher, can you go in and if you see that 70% of your students missed one particular question or something like that, you see that and you're able to then say, this is something that I've got to work on.
Yeah, that's the vision. So right now, we release about 30%, give or take, of our questions each year. And so right now, that is a report that is published much, much, much later than our student results, that a teacher would actually have to go look that up and then come back and kind of compare and contrast with their students. The vision for this portal is that in future years, as we start to release more and more test questions, we're actually able to put that information in real time, so educators can see what did groups of students respond to, how can I go in and see that information in real time. And and ultimately, we would like parents to be able to do that as well, right? To see how did my student respond and what that looks like.
Just one quick question. Will parents still get a hard copy score report?
Yes.
You guys said that. And then just generally looking back, how does this fall, I mean, it sounds like it's gone very well, but how does that compare to sort of recent years? Because fall has often been our lesser challenge.
Correct.
In terms of the assessment, delivery, and administration.
Yep.
But how would you contrast
So
it?
I would say a couple things. One is this was the first time in 5 years that our high schools have actually tested on paper. They have been online for our end of course exams for several years. And so we did have a lot of questions about, are they going to kind of go with the flow and no, but our team at the state did a phenomenal job of regional trainings, of updating our regional meetings and our webinars, and updating our training for building and testing coordinators to make sure that they knew what to expect. And so I will give a lot of credit to the state team for updating those. Pearson did an excellent job of being with us in those regional meetings, but also doing a second set of introductory meetings regionally to go over their platforms, introduce themselves, et cetera, which I think that face-to-face help with our districts was very impactful. I'll also say that we were able to see very clean and clear and professional logistics out of Pearson. One of the things that we struggled with previous vendors is the scope of the operation and what that actually looks like getting to schools. And so what we heard from schools is this is a much cleaner packed job, much more well organized. The materials are better prepared. The boxes are more professional. The pallets, I have a map of what's in a pallet and where everything goes. They're organized by school, so it's incredibly easy for me to distribute. And so I just think the organization and the logistics of a vendor like Pearson, that's a much larger vendor, that was very clean, and it definitely led to some of the success on the ground, because districts and schools, it took a lot of the guesswork out of the delivery of those materials.
So, Casey, first of all, kudos to the department for reversing pretty much quickly what had been a real problem for a long time. It's outstanding. I'm sitting wondering what uses this could provide us as a board. Can we follow the trajectory of a student who may be, well, at any level, but below or approaching, and see how they do in the subsequent test, like English 1 to English 2, if those deficiencies have improved? Mm-hmm. If they're still approaching, or if they're, and certainly if they're on track or mastered, if they started to drop. I mean, if we can see a positive trajectory as opposed to, and I think parents need to see that.
Absolutely. So you'll see this is a screenshot of our parent portal, and I have clicked on the test results tab here, but there's also a test history page. And so all of the tests that a student has taken this year and then in subsequent years will be logged there, so a parent can see that growth longitudinally over time. That's our vision for one of the things inside this portal. And for educators, I think that's absolutely, we want to be able to see that data at a student level, at a class or teacher level, and at a school level, so we can see trends and address those in time. So absolutely, that's a vision. And Mike and I will work with our data use team and accountability team to bring you all the results that you would like to see.
One other question: are we tracking the number of clicks you guys get? I mean, are we market penetration?
Yes, so we will be. This is scheduled to go live the first week of February. That's actually one of the things we're working with Pearson on is is understanding the traffic to the site. And I've asked for in-depth Google analytics on the site itself. I want to know where, what links parents are clicking on, where they're spending time on the site, et cetera. So I've asked for that information, and I'll be reviewing it when this launches, because I think, we need to not only ask for feedback, but also to evaluate if what we're doing is working and is making sense, and then to make changes along the way. So that's absolutely something that my team will be reviewing and addressing.
What has been the difference, because we've gone back to paper, and obviously online is much faster.
Right.
So what is the difference, in years past, and I know we've had some issues with things not going the right way, but as far as high school, what has been the delay online versus paper?
So paper, when you're thinking about what has to happen with online, I have a student's data immediately as soon as they hit submit. For paper, it takes several days for that score document to be logged for the school testing coordinator. Then it gets transferred to the district testing coordinator. It gets boxed and shipped back. So I'm accounting for those days of travel. I'm also accounting for the days of shipping. When it arrives at Pearson, it needs to sit on a floor and acclimate to the environment there, the weather there, and then it needs to be scanned. And then going through that scanning process, that's processed in batches. And then a batch of data is then transferred for the data. And now finally we have visibility into data, and that's 2 weeks after a student presses basically submit. And so there's multiple weeks that we would need to account for, the logistics there. And I will say the sheer volume of documents you saw, 86,000 tests, and many of those tests for English, for example, there's multiple subparts. I'm having to scan different documents at different times because I have to scan the essay, and then that's hand graded. So someone's reading all those essays and grading them separate from the other scanning documents. So we had, 110,000 documents scanned. That takes time. And then when on the computer, the data is instantly linked to an individual student, right? Because I have to authenticate as a secure student in order to be given that secure test and submit it. With paper, we do our best to pre-print all the information about a student on that score document, but sometimes things go wrong. Maybe that sticker was placed incorrectly. Maybe a student ended up bubbling something that didn't match the sticker. And so every time there's one of those inconsistencies, we have to review that image by hand and correct it by hand. And so there's just a lot more work to connect data with individual students and make sure. Now, I will say that we met those published deadlines that we created originally, believing we would be in an online world. We met those deadlines this year for fall with paper, and that was in part because the highest level of Pearson leadership said we want this program to go well, and they had shifts of people working around the clock over the holidays to make sure that those documents were scanned. And so we've learned a lot from the fall, and we are now anticipating what spring will look like. So I'm literally working with our partners at Pearson to talk about the hours that it's taking to seal test booklets, the hours it's taking to scan, how many pallets are on the floor of the warehouse to ship certain things at certain times, and watching that operations dashboard in terms of when documents are coming in and going out. There's just a lot more logistical coordination to make sure that we get that data, and that a given test data is connected accurately to a specific student, and that student is connected accurately to their school and their teacher and their district. And so there's more moving pieces there to make sure we get it right. Did that answer?
Yes.
That was a lot of
Yes.
detail, but
So it's good to know that, Pearson stepped up and was still able to meet the deadlines.
absolutely. And so right now we're looking at spring in the understanding originally that we could potentially be testing online. Now that we are all paper in the spring, we are solutioning with them to make sure that we've identified some potential risks of things that could take longer, and then we're working with our districts to say, okay, where can we do things to make sure that things are moving through the process more quickly.
And for what it's worth, all of the deadlines for reporting and everything, we've either been as fast as or ahead of times last year when things were online. So despite the fact that paper is inherently slower, we've been keeping pace and improving on it.
Let's move on.
And that's a good transition, I think, about what spring looks like. So we have a lot of feedback from fall. I mean, this was our first go with a new vendor, and so we have some changes that we are putting in place prior to the spring testing window. In order to make sure that we're getting accurate student information on those pre-ID labels, we have made some updates to our state data platform to ensure more accurate student provisioning. We did have districts that were doing changes in the fall, and we want to make sure that we give districts more time to do that, but also that we're taking burdens off of our school and district leaders to do that. We're making enhancements to the Pearson platform to provide additional reports for districts. And so we heard feedback from the field of, hey, I wish I could just see a list of all the kids who I'd marked X. And so we've actually made those requests to Pearson, and they're making those software enhancements now to produce those additional reports for our schools and districts for the spring. We've already talked about changes to Pearson customer service training in real time to make sure that they're addressing questions as they come up. And we've actually bumped up the time that our team and our IT team are pulling student data from districts to give the districts more time to review and make sure that information is accurate. And that's something we've worked with the directors of schools on, and that they were very happy to say, yes, let's do that earlier to give our teams more time. We're changing some of the manuals, et cetera, to address questions that we heard in the fall. So, which way do I stick this label, et cetera? We're putting in pictures to make sure that runs more smoothly. And we're opening our test security training earlier to allow districts more time to get that taken care of as well. So these are not large changes, but they are in direct response to what we've heard in the field to make that spring move more quickly.
So we were having technological challenges, as you know, with the conference call. So Lillian and Daryl are watching and texting me questions. So this
great.
is a Lillian question. She was wondering what assurances Pearson is making in terms of data quality and the connection between the data and the student. Is there like if it's is there a person who's checking that? Is there like a double check?
There are so many people.
Briefly
Yes.
about kind of how
Absolutely. So all data is reviewed by multiple sets of people, both on Pearson's side and on our side. And so the assessment team, we have wonderful psychometricians that are on our team that we actually have looked separately at data to make sure that they're coming to the same conclusions, they're seeing the same things. And Pearson, we've worked with them for an extensive quality control process that goes through multiple teams to ensure that data is accurate as well. And so it's not just one person. There are multiple folks and multiple levels of approval that data goes through both on the Pearson side and on our team to make sure that we have questions, we're able to respond quickly and then make changes. And so there's a lot of information that's going back and forth, and the volume of data that we're processing. Our team has done a great job of setting up some of those quality checks in advance. And so once we have data files, there's very specific questions that we're looking for. Some of those are based on issues that we've had with previous vendors, et cetera. But again, what we've seen thus far is we've been very impressed with the quality.
Great, thank you.
I know one of the concerns or maybe complaints from testing coordinators is when we do the paper testing is the number of booklets and the things to keep up with. What is that going to look like in the spring? Is it going to be one book, two books, one for each subject?
It's different based on different grades and subjects. So lower grades, we do combine books for multiple subjects. However, when you're thinking about some of our tests, we're designed with subparts. So when you put multiple subjects together, now you have 6 or 7 different stickers, and watching the third graders try and break just the right sticker, that's something to consider as well. And so there are, in our early grades, students actually can mark in the test booklet. There's not a separate bubble sheet. That's because of, we find developmentally that's more appropriate and gives us a better quality. And so there's less documents at those earlier grades. We combine math and English in one book, for example, and then they're writing directly in the test booklet. For our older grades, they have a separate answer document. And our end of course exams obviously are broken up by subject area, but some of our earlier grades are combined. All right. So the next slide, and Amy, no, you're fine. Is looking ahead. So as we've talked about the implications going from paper to online, that we're making sure that we're putting things in place to make sure to improve the quality and make sure that we're getting the data back earlier. So one of the questions that I saw from the board was about an update on our current development RFP. So we have a different vendor who's responsible for the development of our questions and our tests than we do for administration. And right now that vendor's is ETS, that their contract goes until this fall. And so we are currently working on an RFP to rebid that contract for the development of our test questions and test forms. That is going back and forth right now with the comptroller and in various stages of review. But our current goal is to drop that in February and to hope to have a signed contract in place that allows us some transition time there as well. And so I'm happy to answer questions on that, but I also, there may be some I'll be a little cagey, just knowing that that procurement will go live very soon.
In development, just a question, in developing the test, do the teachers take the exams as trials themselves?
So that's a perfect transition to the next bullet about where we recruit educators to actually assist in the development process. So we have teachers at multiple places in the development process. They help us actually look at the test questions and review test questions prior to us ever field testing anything. And for our English language arts, they're actually looking at passages. So the readings that those questions are based on, they're looking at passages first, and then they're coming back, looking at items. And then we have educators come in and assess with the standard setting. So after questions are field tested and we create assessments and have students take them, we actually have Tennessee teachers come in, review the results of that, and help with to set those cut scores. So for science and social studies, we'll be bringing to the board recommendations this summer about cut scores for those first operational exams. And definitely in that standard setting process, we have educators that will take every single question because they want to know what this feels like, what it looks like in practice. But definitely there are educators involved at every step of the way. And they all have their different reviews, but yes, I have seen teachers actually sit down and take those exams, yeah.
So, I'm going to fumble through this, but part of the process for those teachers that are helping review is alignment to the standards.
Right.
And they're commenting on that whether it is or it isn't.
Correct.
What is the process or the goal in setting the cut score? So and she said primarily it's a criterion test, can be used as a formative, but it's how many answers you get right and wrong. The body of knowledge and how much that I may have gotten that wrong, but if we then take that information and apply a cut score, then we're giving a grade. It's almost becoming a norm test.
Yes and no, but
Sure. So when it comes to these these tests that we have to create and distribute on a massive scale, law requires that we make new questions every year. When we make new questions, not all questions are created equal. Some are easier and some are harder. Like maybe there was, on this particular standard, there was an easy question one year, hard question another year. In order to make it fair from year to year and from test to test and from student to student, there's a lot of math that goes into figuring out exactly how do we combine these scores into something that is fair and comparable and translatable. All of TVOS depends on having scale score and cut scores that are fair to year, despite the fact like questions change and things change. So the point of setting those cut scores is partly just so we have something that is fair and comparable from year to year.
Fair to who?
To I guess everyone. It's to make the test comparable.
So a student taking biology 1 year, he or she should not get a different score whether he took that biology in the fall of his 10th grade year or the spring of his junior year. We should be able to say a given test is going to be equitable across the different years or different versions of a test.
So do you set up the results based on some like normal distribution or something like that, and that's how you determine the cut scores?
Much more complicated than a normal distribution. This
I'm asking,
but-
it would
but
be,
like-
I mean, some statistical
right.
model.
Yeah.
that you
So
use is what I meant.
there are people that get full master's degrees in just learning how to do the process.
Right.
But we use what's called item response theory models, and these models will basically, they seek to measure a student's underlying ability by analyzing each one of the questions and the performance on the different questions. And so it's less fitting to some predetermined distribution, and more as it is using questions that we know the performance on with some of these new questions to be able to figure out what are the relationships, and so where would we expect kids to perform. So we use questions. So law also has that we've got 30% of questions we pass from year to year. Those questions help us to gauge and to make sense of all the new questions that we've created. So it's not like an arbitrary thing that we're just setting each time. It's a standard that has been set that we use to create the fairness from test to test to test. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So by having these sets of questions that go from year to year, then you have a standard to compare against, from then which you can then look at the others and come up with some rationalization for your cut scores.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Because those cut scores are determining, has a student mastered the standard? Is a student on track? Is a student kind of below that proficiency mark? And so we would expect that students who are scoring in those places to behave similarly, right?
But does it assume that each class from 1 year to the next year, that the next one comes up, is basically the same?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't assume that. It assumes that the items themselves are that there is some that as long as we've got items that we can compare from year to year, that the items contain the information that's needed. So it could be everybody is better, everybody is worse. It'll show that. It doesn't pre-norm kids to perform some way.
Okay. That was,
Yeah, because you would not want to suppress growth, right?
Oh,
If we're
right.
seeing real
Exactly.
growth year to year.
I mean, we had talked about TVOS. TVOS operates completely differently than this.
Did that answer it?
yeah.
We'll
thank you.
be talking a lot more about that standard setting process this summer because our new science exams and the social studies exams that are based on the new social studies standards, that this is the first year that those are operational, and so we'll be talking through that standard setting process this summer. So in the return to online, we've gathered a lot of data this fall to help us make the determination of should we return some of our tests online versus doing them in paper, and then if so, what grades and subjects would be appropriate to do that. And so the two largest sets of data that we collected were speaking directly to directors of schools and in a large setting where we had all of them together to have this conversation and actually polling them on what what the experience had been in their districts and what they recommended. And then we got a lot of information, very tactical on the ground information about bandwidth, devices, and district setup through a district technology survey that we were going directly to the district technology coordinators. We've then pulled all of that information together, discussed with our administration vendor what their expectations were and what how the transition would be from our development vendor who's actually creating the test to then passing the test and creating it in an online environment. And after evaluating all that information, we made the recommendation to move online for our end of course exams only next year. So this is effectively high school, although we do know that some students can take some of those end of course exams in late middle school. But this gives us an appropriate, our high schools and our districts are itching to get back online for high school. That was something that they knew and they felt comfortable with. And then earlier returns of that data in high school, that information is used in grades, obviously, and so they want that data sooner. And it gives us time then to evaluate how this is working prior to scaling more broadly in the earlier grades. Directors of schools were pleased with this recommendation. They want to get back online, but they also want it to be successful. And so I think a measured approach to scaling this over the next few years is the right thing to do. And this will give us the ability to see how that works with a new vendor while also continuing to prepare for the future. So in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to make that successful. So the very first thing we are doing is this March, every single district in the state will be participating in one of our first tests for online. We have loaded every single one of our practice tests for our science exams from early grades all the way up through biology in an online platform. We're actually doing user acceptance testing on that right now. That will open up for districts in February, and then on March 5th, we will have a very targeted window where students will be logging on in a simulated test environment so we can see what this looks like on the Pearson's platform. We will have Pearson technology staff on site. We will have an operations dashboard at the department where we'll actually be watching in real time what this looks like in the Pearson system. And then Pearson will also deploy regional staff to be on site at identified districts that have requested support as well. Following that, that's just step one. That's to test the Pearson system to make sure that it's behaving how we would expect and that our relationship with their staff is what we would expect. This summer, the second step of that is to give districts support on our actual devices. And so in terms of which computers or tablets they're using, which browsers they're using, how up-to-date is specific software, et cetera, we will have a large window that will be open for them to do tests of individual devices and make sure that we are on track with understanding how the specific computers or tablets that a district has on site will work with the platform. And then finally, in both fall and spring, prior to our operational windows, we will be doing full verification tests. It's not just a test of the Pearson platform and their ability to scale, but also the device readiness and individual test environment. And that will be secure test environments to give schools and districts the most real experience that they can have prior to going into that operational exam. So we're actually testing everything. It mirrors that experience before the window in both fall and spring. So this way we've got a multiple step process that graduates to test different things at different times to ensure that when we bring it all together, our schools and districts will be ready. So districts will be getting this month a month-by-month checklist of to-dos that will start January, go through the load test through the summer and then into the fall. We're conducting in-person regional meetings with both our technology coordinators and our testing coordinators in February to address questions prior to that verification test in March. Pearson is in attendance at that regional meeting. They are also attending our regional technology council meetings, and so they've already already been a presence with our district technology coordinators already this year. They are providing on-site district technology support at identified districts, and they will have regional staff available during the verification test for on-site support if necessary. And then we'll be doing school and district surveys after that test to see what's the experience from a district's perspective, and then from a given school that's logging in and conducting this exam, what does the experience look like in the moment? So we can gauge and match up what we're seeing on our dashboards in terms of what bandwidth looks like, how the platform is performing. We can match that up with a student experience. How long is it taking them to load an individual question? Do they have any issues logging in? Do they have any issues submitting the test, et cetera? And then going forward, starting next year, we'll be opening some practice assessments and formative tools in that online environment. So even for our early grades that won't be formally testing online next year, they will have access to full-length practice tests and formative questions so they can start to experience that online environment. Educators can start to prepare students for that, and they can have some real-time results to some of those assessments during the year. And so that will give us a lot of feedback, particularly from our middle schools, where before we make the decision to transition middle school to online, we will have real experiences in middle schools using the test platform provided by Pearson to get their direct feedback with how that's working.
Is that the tool where the released items will be stored?
Correct. So our goal is to have a variety of formative tools for districts starting next year. Our released items we want to be able to access, and we want that to be in the same platform that a student will experience. And so if a teacher chooses to print out an exam and do that, we want them to have that flexibility. But if they want to just test one question quickly at the end of a class period, give the students the experience with that TestNav platform, they'll be able to do that. And so we want those practice tests that will mirror the operational exam, so be the exact same length, the exact same number of questions, the same standard breakdown that we have available that the districts can use as an interim exam or a benchmark exam throughout the year, or they can use as a practice leading up to an operational window. We will have those live in the platform, as well as released items is our goal for next year. And so that supports us with the readiness factor of being able to test how this platform does on devices at schools. It gives students the ability to interact with this platform on a much more regular basis, and it gives educators tools that they can use to actually inform instruction in the classroom in much more real time than a standalone summative assessment.
And to be clear, a lot of these things this next year, since it'll be the first year, will be kind of in pilot mode. We're going to be seeking a lot of feedback from stakeholders, and we won't be like releasing everything in the whole wide world.
Right.
It's going to be trying to get it right.
Good.
So if you have end of course in 2020 and 2021, do you have a goal of 2021, 2022 to be completely online, or have you set a goal for?
We have not. I mean, I think we're listening to districts. We know what has happened in the past when we've moved quickly. We want to get this right. And so we are listening to districts. We wanted to provide as many opportunities as possible for our schools and districts to experience the platform and listen to them and be on the ground with them to see how this works. Obviously, there's a lot of benefit to taking tests in a digital platform. Earlier score returns are a big piece of that, but it also allows us to do more innovative things with questions and more innovative things with data in the moment. And so ultimately, we'd like to get there, but we want to make sure that the assessment is valid and reliable first, and it's a quality experience for every single kid.
Yeah. And on the technology side, it's not so much the technology that we're providing to schools that might be a limiting factor. Some of them have very antiquated technology or laptops and may not be able to handle some of the awesome things that we want to provide. And so there's going to be we've got a lot of, like Casey already mentioned, we've got a lot of things built in to make sure that when we do transition and start moving people to online, that they've got the runway that they need, they've got the support that they need to get through it.
And one other question, how long is the Pearson contract for?
3 years. I believe it was 3 with
Are there any
options.
options to that, or you would go back and rebid again, or?
I believe so, but let me double check and
Either 3 or
and
5.
get you.
Yeah.
I believe it's 3 with options 4 or
Okay.
5, but I want to make sure that I'm telling you the right thing.
Okay, thanks.
Question from Lillian. She said, who's doing the training for teachers on the formative assessment tools that are going to be available?
That's a great question. This will look different district by district. We're working with Pearson to create very simple videos and other training guides. We will be doing regional assessment meetings and then sharing this information directly with our district leaders that can then redeliver to educators. But if you think about the scope and span of how many educators, we don't have the ability to do in-person trainings that are led by the state. So we'll be providing training tools, videos, guides, et cetera, and then that'll look different in district to district and school to school. But we also want to hear feedback from districts too on
More
what
train
they
the
need.
trainer in
Yeah.
terms of regional.
And we'll have also more clarity on that. I mean, we're still in the process of building the thing that will ultimately do this. So we will have more clarity on what those trainings will be and what it will look like as we, as the.
Get closer to the
as
fall.
Right, as we are able to build some of these things and see what the kind of the learning curve is gonna look like. Right now, it's still unknown as we're still.
And you'll
working
test
on
some
it.
of those out, I guess, with real users and see kind of what you can advise districts, I would imagine, in terms of the training that teachers would need. Yeah, great.
Any other questions on the online assessments? Okay, next, we actually had changed the order to do that first and then do the chemistry and English 3
Yes.
in the course exams next.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. So I want this to be a discussion where we're able to answer questions and considerations that you all have. So Amy, on the next slide, I've given just kind of some general things to talk through here over, I believe it was 2 meetings ago when Mike first asked the question about the decision to eliminate the chemistry and English 3 end of course exams. And just looking back, wanted to give a little bit of details about all of the information that was gathered leading up to those decisions. And so as we polled teachers and directors of schools and district instructional leads, and what we found was there was some concern about particularly the junior year of high school and just the volume of assessments that were being given at that particular point in a student's career. It is a really important point in a student's career because we're looking forward toward what happens after high school, but it's the year where we've actually gathered the most amount of data on each individual student. And so some of the feedback that we heard from the field was, where our educators are feeling like there's multiple assessments that are measuring different things and we're serving different masters. But also some of these assessments feel much more relevant to individual students and families than others. And frankly, some feel more relevant to educators because they're using the data in a certain way than others. And so when we actually broke down and went assessment by assessment to dig into that feedback, English 3 and chemistry came up as one, the least tested. So if you think about the number of students that are taking each one of these assessments, by the time a student gets to their junior or senior year, there are other options for some of those graduation requirements, or dual enrollment, dual credit classes, AP classes, Cambridge IB. There's a lot of students that were electing to take other courses other than chemistry, or that were in dual enrollment English already instead of that English 3. And so educators felt like they weren't getting as much information about those students as they could, and that they already had a lot of other information about a student. Again, our junior year, we're seeing ACT in addition to our end of course assessments, and by that time we have a testing history on a student that spans all the way back to 3rd grade. So we've got a lot of information about our individual students and concerns about students, what they were taking seriously, and how schools and districts were using those assessments. And so if it was the questions of, well, based on how valuable we find this data, the information that we have on these students already, what are your recommendations? And a task force that was brought together looked at all of this data and made that difficult decision that, this feels like the right thing to do to make sure that the focus for specific students in these areas were placed in the right place, and we were not losing important information on other assessments. For example, our earlier English exams, our math exams, educators use this data much more regularly in their classrooms, and so that was important that we keep that information. I'm happy to talk through, in terms of what are the opportunities if we're looking at the future, how much it would cost to create and build an assessment from scratch if we're going to come back and think through adding additional assessments. But we really want to make sure that the reasons why we have these in place for teacher accountability, school and district accountability, and frankly for instructional improvement, that's how this information is being used. But for chemistry, we were seeing just a very low number of our cohort that were taking that course, taking that exam, and there was not a next logical step in science that teachers were not using that data to then inform instruction for later courses for students. And so there was the cost benefit analysis of are we gaining enough information that we're using the right way to sustain that exam. I will say that for English 3 and chemistry, we had built originally practice exams for those tests. And so if that is something that that we believe will be important and helpful for educators through our new portal, that is something that we could pull back up and redeploy. So there is an opportunity for us to say, we had an English 3 full practice test already. We still own all of those test questions. Those are Tennessee. That is something that we could very quickly redeploy if needed. If educators said, yes, that would be helpful for us. We know that these questions are aligned to our standards, et cetera. So I think that there's some opportunities for us to support, even without pulling a new summative assessment back on the agenda.
You got a question?
Well, I'm the one that pulled the pin on this grenade. I go back to the early days of standards. I mean, just back during Bredesen, I was on a committee and it was like that last scene in Bonnie and Clyde. It was not pleasant. But the one thing that was hammered in, standards were never ever discussed without making the strong point that it only has any value if it's aligned with the assessments. Mm-hmm. That you can really have standards, but your curriculum could be off from the standards to the point, what you test could be a lot less than the full body of standards, and you can engineer an outcome that really looks good. And it doesn't inform anybody, but including the student, as to how much content they have mastered to some degree, which means how much they're ready for the next stage. So since we eliminated English 3 and chemistry, I just can't get that out of my head. We can check it off to pathology, but and probably be true. But when you look at how we're performing across the state, and the ACTs are different than the end of course. They're telling us to. But when you look at what we're doing in science, mm-hmm. which is better, surprisingly, but we're still having a whole bunch of kids who are just slightly below 50, or about 43% or something. In English, it's north of 50. It's like 57, and we even say in this that really English ought to be considered a reading. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and we know that reading, and it goes back to third grade, but we have a lot of kids going to TBR schools and everywhere else who are gone, and a lot of them think they're ready to walk into those places, so we're giving them misinformation at some point. So if we're relying on either the district or the classroom to develop the final exam, to put it in the Mike Edwards simple nomenclature, one, that is a test. It's occupying, now it's got more administration by the LEA, but as far as that kid's test taking versus instruction time, they're sitting there taking a test. And if they're not taking a final, we ought to know about it. Because what formative information do they have on how to give them a grade? Or how does that kid know that they're ready to walk in the next step? The other thing is that when we did that, when we took away the EOC, we took away the requirement for those courses to be taught by teachers who have that endorsement. And I've often wondered if that wasn't a convenience in leaving EOCs out of physics, because physics isn't really an easy thing to go out and find an endorsed teacher in. But chemistry is probably not too far behind it. I know we have a lot more chemistry majors or people who have gotten endorsed in chemistry, and they're doing real well. But I think of those kids who are having to be taught by someone who is not only not a science teacher, but just not in, they could be in a whole different, and they got dealt a hand that said, we're gonna ask you to give up Beowulf this semester, this year, and ask you to teach chemistry. That's a pretty tough spot, but it is unacceptable to have those kids to be involved in that. I understand the information that districts get is being limited in the 11th grade because they've gotten a lot of information prior to that. But one of the things I try to do is not just look at from the perspective of the district. And I have immense respect and empathy for how they're having to deal with a whole lot of problems. And I'm sitting in their shoes, that's going to make, but what's in the best interest of students has to, I believe, always be at the forefront of what this board does. I don't know that anybody in education would think it's not in their forefront, but I happen to be sitting on this board, and that's what I keep reminding myself. And that information is relevant to them. I believe it is incredibly important for them, whether they like the test or they like having it, and hopefully more and more students are coming to the point that there is life that's going to depend on their knowledge and mastery that's going to, after high school, that's going to determine how they live. And so here's where my rambling is going. I think we're heading, I doubt seriously that we'll ever deal with another elimination in the next near future of an EOC exam. That being said, I think that it was a mistake to have done that. It was ill-advised. I accept as much responsibility as a lot of the people weren't even on this board. And it made sense. When I talked to Commissioner McQueen, it was 11th grade, they're getting hammered with a lot of tests anyway. Why don't we get rid of two? And I remember asking, well, they're going to be taking some tests. But making these points then, in my mind, is something I should have done then. That being said, I would just like for us to reconsider adding those back in. As far as the cost goes, I don't know. It'll be interesting when we hear that number, but the truth is it will be extremely easy for us to say, oh gosh, that's a lot of money, we can't do that. When in fact, we didn't consider what that cost saving was going to be at the time. It was not ever part of the argument to get rid of it. It was never on our decision-making matrix to take it out, and I don't think we ought to have it on our matrix to put it back in. It was never part of the reason, so I think we ought to think of the reasoning to put it back in neutral of what the cost is. It can be solved. One of the things from the pros of getting rid of chemistry, I was looking through these, were the ones that you mentioned, except one of the reasons was, well, there's no physics EOC, so these would be more parallel. We could say that about any subject EOC. I mean, it's just, but when I was looking at the cons of getting rid of the EOC, there would be no state-level data for success in chemistry. Parents and students will not receive information regarding on track. Approaching and below are the same. It's marketing. On track and mastery is probably MIT, and on track is probably Mike Edwards Scholarship, but maybe the third one down. But that is important. And having alignments done by people who may not even be endorsed in the subject is not, those are two major courses that I think, I'm going to shut up because I'm starting to repeat myself.
Well, can I add a few things to it? First, let me thank you, Mike, for coming, and I know this is something that you have a passion for, and I appreciate your continuing to bring this to the board, because I too think it's important. And let me say a couple of things. One is, I don't know which came first, the cart or the horse, with regard to, did we drop the EOC because we didn't have endorsed teachers, or did we not have endorsed teachers, therefore we dropped the EOC? You know, so I'm not sure about that. But the point is, if a student takes a chemistry class, at the end, you need to know, I as a school district want to know, did that student learn the important information that if they go on, I'm a chemical engineering major, but if I go to UT, that I've got the basis to succeed in college. And if I don't take a standard test, such as an EOC, how do I know that teacher, particularly if they're not endorsed in the subject, is transmitting that information to the student who we want to succeed? And I think the EOC does that. And have we talked to the universities to ask them about the importance, or looked at the results, data guy here, looked at the results of EOCs versus non-EOCs and information that it provides? I know I got to take honors chemistry at UT because of how I did in chemistry in the high school. How do you decide whether a person is going to go in honors chemistry if you haven't given some standard test? So I share your feeling from a physics standpoint. I agree. I mean, just because they don't do it in physics, I mean, we ought to do it in physics. And if it's the fact that the state can't get endorsed teachers in those areas, maybe we're not paying the teachers, going back to good old differentiated pay or something like that, maybe we're not paying the teachers to get endorsements in those subjects, and maybe that's what we ought to look at. How do we solve that problem, so again, that we give our students the best opportunity that we can have so they can succeed when they get out?
Let me make it, I think, and raised this before, but whenever we discuss endorsements, we have to decide whether they mean something or not. Are they important to us? Because it's real easy for us to start justifying, well, I'm not a constitutional expert, but there is a lot of conversation going on about education in Tennessee and its constitution. It is to provide an education to Tennesseans, and I believe that means a noun and not just a verb. If it's hard to get people who have demonstrated an expertise in a subject in a classroom, that is no reason to lower the standard. It is all the reason to figure out how to get those people in a classroom. And it may be differential pay. It may be getting people being more aggressive and getting non-traditional teachers in the class. It may be a myriad of things. And again, I'm going to go back and say I fully understand the hand that's been dealt to administrators on having walking in on a fall the beginning of a year only to find out your English 3 teacher or your chemistry or whoever didn't show up, has decided not to come back, and what are you going to do with that class down the hall? I really believe as long as we provide the out, and they're going to take it, which is going to be not having to think through how do I get this now that things are changed, and I can't ignore that, because ultimately you got to have people qualified standing in front of that classroom, transmitting their information into those kids. You can't teach what you don't know.
So just a couple of thoughts and maybe a question too, and just be aware of the microphone. They were saying it's a little hard to pick up if you move it over to your mouth when you're talking, Casey.
Okay.
All right. I mean, I think it's still within the board's purview to think about sort of requiring an endorsement for these courses short of the law that requires it. So that's something that I think should be on the table for just future conversations at the board level. And then I know in terms of, the other implication, not having state information that we can look at for student learning in these courses. I mean, it is particularly concerning given that I think the students that are taking these courses are the ones that are not taking those advanced courses, and so ones that potentially need the additional remediation and need the advantage of that 12th grade year to kind of make sure that they are ready to go on post-secondary of some kind. And so having that information seems important for districts and schools. And so what can we do at the state level? Casey, you started to mention the practice assessments. I mean, short of, what are we thinking? I mean, I think the ACT is not aligned, obviously, to our state standards, so it gives you some information, but not great information on how students are doing in English and Chemistry 3 if they are taking those, or chemistry, those courses. Let's flesh that out a little bit more, because I think that's sort of at the crux of the issue is how do we at the state level ensure that districts and schools are getting good and accurate information about student learning for these students who may be a small proportion of our students, but who are really important in terms of ensuring that they're on track when they graduate high school to be successful in post-secondary.
Absolutely. So I do want to say that the original task force recommendations around the removal of these exams was not solely based on teacher availability. So I want to make sure that, that task force looked at a lot of information from educators themselves, et cetera. And so I don't want it to look as if this was a lowering of standards. This was a reaction.
It was really Bob now that was making that point. You all didn't. You weren't arguing that point, and we understand that.
Okay.
We kind of went
And I
down
was on
that
that task force.
road.
I recall the same. It really wasn't driven by the teacher certification conversation. That's just a byproduct, though, of the decision now that we could come back to. But yeah.
So in hearing, Mike, about your concerns, it feels like there's two main questions. One is around the educators, and so I think we'd be happy to bring data around what that educator situation looks like in the state, and have a team, our human capital team, to talk more about that. And I know they're doing some pretty innovative things in terms of recruitment and retention as well for educators. So we can address that, and I think Director Morrison also talked about things that you all can do as a board to think through that as well. We're happy to support with whatever data we can provide there. And then the second thing I heard was around alignment, is making sure how are we measuring what our students know and can do that's based on the expectations that we have as a state. And so I think there's a few things that we as a department can do there. One is ensure really high quality materials are in the hands of our students. And so ELA, that materials adoption process is going through, is in process right now. And that's something for our English educators that they will have, and make sure that those materials are of the highest quality and are aligned to our standards. So I think that the department and the textbook commission has done a lot of work on those materials. And then the other part is providing questions and support for educators that would be aligned to TCAP assessment type questions. And so we do have a bank of items that were previously used for these assessments that we can provide, and we have released items for English 3 in the past. And so those are things that that we can provide directly to teachers. I mentioned that English 3 practice test that we have shared in the past. Making that available is something that is possible, so that there's a clear document that is aligned to our standards and that meets that level of rigor in terms of, in order to demonstrate mastery on a Tennessee specific standard, this is what a student needs to be able to do. And we do have some of those available.
So I think the department is offering help to any district out there that wants to avail themselves of it. But it's still elective. They can decide. There's 147 districts out there, but they all have kids in them, and they all have the right to get the same education that they're going to get somewhere else. I believe if one of the recommendations was that teachers sort of like the idea of getting a state test to give. Well, one, that means they're still getting a test in November, in the 11th grade. Again, it may be cumbersome on the district or on the school, but the student's getting the same impact. They're taking a test, and they're going to be taking tests throughout their EOC. You can't dodge it. Mm-hmm. And if the cynical part of me, if I'm trying to engineer outcomes in my school or my district, two really tough ones that could drag you down is something like chemistry and something like English 3. So I could do a CRIP test, to be blunt, and basically guarantee a good outcome, whether those kids are really walking away with the standard knowledge at some level or not. What Bob said, he can, in my mind, make a much stronger argument for adding physics than we did for eliminating chemistry and English 3.
Let me suggest this, and I do appreciate the department willing to work with us. And it sounds like that we on the state board have some work that we need to do. If you could look and see what a cost would be, I think that would be helpful to us to understand. But I would like to see, what options that we have, because I agree with Mr. Edwards, and I appreciate you bringing it up, that, we need that standardization to know whether we're teaching those students what they need to know when they go post-secondary.
If we could, in getting us the cost, if we could get the fixed cost and then the incremental cost, because we know we've got certain costs already built in that's not going to, it's going to be there whether we give one test or 86,000 tests, so that we can see how we're adding these or how much, and was it a quid pro quo? Did we save that amount of money when we took it out? Is it, but give us some more information rather than saying it's $12 zillion.
Right.
Yeah.
It's 12 zillion.
Yeah, almost. Absolutely. And so I do have some numbers that I've just based on our current development contract. And so we can go through, but again, knowing that there is a development procurement coming, I wanted to be, respectful of what we shared here, with respect to that. But if we're thinking about the things that would have to happen every year, a revision of test specifications, we pay by the item for every question we develop and test. The actual composition of the test books and creation, whether we use printed books or whether that's a full battery of questions that are given to a student, you're looking at more than $1 million to create a test from scratch with specific, assuming a few hundred questions that we develop, et cetera, with the prices that we've got here. I think administration, that again is additional cost depending on, are we printing test books or are we using a platform where there's a basic setup? It's the same platform regardless of how many tests we push through. So I think that there's some variability in costs there. But in terms of the things we would have to do every year, test specification, question development, the committee meetings that we have to review these ongoing. And so thank you, Amy, for putting the life cycle on the screen. Deciding now to create a new test. Just to give you a perspective of where we are in the cycle, we are creating and reviewing new items right now for a science test, for example, that were built on specifications we updated last year. So in the fall and summer and fall, we trained those item writers on the updated specifications, et cetera. They've written questions we're reviewing right now. Those will go to teacher committees this summer. They will be field tested next year. They will not appear on an operational test until the year after that. And so by the time we standard set and produce scores, you're looking at basically a 3-year window from creating that first test specification from our standards to creating brand new questions, testing them, seeing the results of those, putting them in practice, and coming. So it's a 3-year process. And each step of the way, there's costs that would be ongoing, recurring every year, all right, to bring those teachers together to create the questions, et cetera, especially if we're releasing more questions to the field.
If you're talking a million out of what? What is the baseline we spend right now on testing overall?
Tens of millions a year.
Yeah. Right. And if you don't start now, you say it's a 3-year process, I understand that, but it's always going to be a 3-year process.
Correct.
So.
That's right.
Just a couple of questions potentially for us to think about too. I'm curious to know what you've heard from districts in the time since we have eliminated these tests. And it occurs to me we're going to be sitting down with TOS at their legislative conference and having conversations sort of regionally with superintendents. So we should ask and sort of, understand from their perspective sort of what this has felt like in the field in terms of not having that information. I also wonder in terms of the development timeline and the cost. We can always develop our own items, but in this case, is it worth looking into borrowing items that are aligned to our standards that have already been created through whatever vendor we end up with in terms of, test development? Could save time and money if, these are relatively small numbers of students that are going to be taking these tests. We want aligned items, but they don't necessarily have to be all created in Tennessee. If there are things that exist, that could be borrowed from item banks, depending on our vendor capabilities. And then the other thing that was occurring to me is we have an optional second grade assessment that most districts use. How do you think about these areas as sort of maybe potentially a similar situation where we want to incentivize districts to use something that the state provides? How many districts are giving the second grade assessment right now?
Nearly all of them.
Nearly all of them, right?
I can pull the exact number, but yeah, it's a
But it could be interesting. I'm just thinking about sort of the spectrum of how we could get to a place where we've got good state level data. And what are the options sort of on that spectrum all the way up to like requiring it as a end of course for everybody like we did in the past. And it may be that we need to just bring this to the board for a decision at some point. I think this was a good opportunity to go into more detail with the subcommittee today and get a little bit more nuance around sort of the options and the trade-offs. But the cost information, I think, is important to understand. Talking to directors of schools, probably a little bit more, that'll be next 2 weeks from now.
We probably need to move on.
Yeah, and we've got accountability still on the
Yeah.
list. So why don't we plan to connect back on sort of those next steps in terms of the additional information, the teachers who are teaching these subjects, and then think about how we, potentially get to a decision point.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, since we are not making any changes to accountability this year, a lot of the questions that we've been having, things that we've been hearing from the field is mostly just people trying to understand, trying to interpret the accountability system, because what is going to happen at the end of the school year is we're going to roll out some letter grades. The handouts that you guys have gotten is currently a working draft, something that we've gotten feedback from a couple different groups already, some leaders, directors of schools, etc. We're going to be getting a lot more feedback on these kinds of tools and other things that we're offering in the next few weeks. We've got some more time set up. And these basically handouts represent a lot of the most common questions we see from directors of schools and trying to understand the accountability system. So I'm going to walk you guys just through each one of the pages, not in detail, but just to kind of give you an overview. One thing that is not in here yet, and that might be helpful for the board, is going to be like an acronym translator. So if when I finish going through this, if there are some questions that we've got on some of the acronyms, then let me know. And we got some feedback as recently from a group of directors and district leadership just a couple days ago. This does not reflect that feedback. We're still in the process of working on that. This first page is just an overview of the weightings of the different things that are used for districts and schools. We'll talk about what some of these little things mean in just a minute, but this is just to help people conceptualize, like, how much does each thing contribute to the overall score.
One thing, it says that 60% of each model is based on all students and 40% are based on historically underserved. How was that number developed, the 40%?
Yeah, the 40%. Oh, yeah.
And does 40% represent the number of underserved, or is that?
Yeah. So the number was developed at the time. 40% of the students in Tennessee, statewide, were a member of one of these historically underserved groups, and so they used this Tennessee number, 40%, to act as the weighting, the proxy for the weighting.
But are you double counting the underserved then? If you're counting, if 60% is all the students, that would include 40%, which are underserved.
That's right.
Then there's another 40%. So are you double counting, and are you?
Yes. In some cases, triple.
So is that intentionally done? And if so, help me understand why.
So I won't be able to give you a lot of information on the intent as I wasn't around, but there are groupings that are required in federal accountability for us to disaggregate by different student groups. In Tennessee, we use 4 groups in accountability, and it was intentional. I mean, it has to have been intentional, because obviously there's a chance that a student has disabilities, who also is low income, who also may be from maybe an English learner, in which case that student would be represented in multiple different groups that would report out for the school. Yeah, I can't speak very much to the rationale. It's not uncommon among states. There are a few states that don't do the double counting. They do some other things, but this is not an unusual practice.
Sometime I would like to understand how that number came up with and why we're double and triple counting those. I mean, there's got to be some reason for it. like to
Right.
understand that better. We can do it some other time, thanks.
Oh, yeah, sure. The next page is a page to help people understand the difference in kind of the overall designations that schools and districts receive. And then there's a table on the bottom that goes through all of the different metrics and how they're measured and how many kids need to be in them between schools and for districts. One thing to note in that first top table is it talks about both the state, there's systems that we use to offer state letter grades. There are separate systems that we use to offer federal designations, and those are the ones found in ESSA. And then there's also other systems that are used to determine whether or not schools exit a certain, like if they've received some kind of poor rating, like either a bad federal or bad state designation, how they exit from that designation. The following page after that are kind of some FAQ type questions. Basically, what are some of the differences between schools and districts? Which student groups are included? And this may help kind of answer some of the question, but it's not gonna answer the question about why a kid may show up multiple times, represented multiple times. And finally, what are some other weird business rules that might affect a school's overall grading?
And why, I see all students, they take school grades A through F, but for these others, it's just A through D. So why do you not consider the F grades for the other students?
Yeah, that one I don't know the rationale behind. I think, well, I can tell you what I think my best guess is. About 6 or 7 years ago, there were metrics that were used to determine like district accountability, and the calculation for receiving an F grade operates on some of those old assumptions around kind of raw proficiency rates, and so it carried over and still is the same system being used to identify the lowest schools, and that calculation only involves the all student groups. And then the rest of the calculations that have been added on top of it include the rest. That's my best guess as to the rationale.
Obviously, since this is the accountability model, I mean, I know we haven't passed this one, but it's being considered, and I know the districts, they are very interested in this thing. We need to be sure that we understand the basis of why each one of these are used in the models as we go forward. So.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you everything that's in the documentation that the state has put out as far as the rationale for why there is a different grading system for the F schools rather than the A through D. But it appears to be based on historic precedent, like continuation of building on like a previous system, and that's.
I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is the F is really the priority status, and so
Correct.
again, you wouldn't have priority status by subgroup, so it's really more of an all student, all school level designation. But
It's
I don't pretend
yeah,
to be
F
expert
schools
here.
are kind of a completely different calculation. The last page I wasn't going to go over very much because this is more focused specifically for like helping school leaders understand where they are in the process, but it actually is a flow chart that shows you kind of where the F ends up. It's a kind of a complicated little flow chart, but it's okay. How are the exit criteria? How are the federal designations? How are all these things related for the end of the school year? And you can see that basically, if you are a priority school, do not leave priority, then that is equivalent to F, and that calculation for priority schools is based on historic precedent.
Okay, just to restate, to make sure I understand this, there will be no changes this school year in the accountability process except for the addition of letter grades. Is that correct?
That's correct. Everything else is exactly the same. Follows the exact same rules. No changes in business rules.
A concern that I've shared in the past is the swing that some districts and schools can see from year to year.
Yep.
Generally, if you look at teacher evaluations, you know, you may go from a 5 to a 4, maybe even 5 to 3, or vice versa. You generally don't see a teacher go from a 5 to a 1. I mean, that's rare, unless maybe there's been a personal issue come up, you know, something very stressful, or a variety of things could happen. You know, generally you don't see that massive swing. So teachers overall, when you look at the teacher survey every year, they feel fairly confident in the evaluation system as far as fairness, because they don't see that. However, districts and schools don't necessarily see that. I know personally in my district, at least 3 schools that have seen the 5 to 1 to 5 to 1 happen over multiple years. And we're not looking at, you know, you've got most of your cohorts that are the same. You know, you lose 1, gain 1. You don't have a total switch in teachers, you know, as far as resources and instruction, it's all the same, but then you're a 5, you're a 1. And so, you know, to go from that on top of the mountain feeling, and then you're down in the valley, and you can't explain what happened. So, you know, I've had some conversations with Sarah about that, you know, about how, is there anything that we can do, either at the department or the board, to kind of look at that?
And you mean TVAS specifically?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
specifically,
absolutely.
yeah.
To see, okay, why are we having these swings so rapidly? You know, is there something that maybe needs to be tightened up a little bit, or re-examined? Because it is disheartening. You know, even though you may remain a level 5 teacher, but your whole school drops to a 1, and so all of your partners, your coworkers, you know, are, you know, they're scratching their head. What happened? So that's a major concern that I hear from all across, not just my district, but the state.
It's a valid concern. I mean, we've communicated to the field that no changes will be happening this year, but it's a valid concern. It's a concern that there are a couple different approaches and answers that could be taken, and right now we're currently in the process of evaluating a lot of those potential solutions to, like, the volatility in TVOS and some of the maybe some of the other swings and things that we see.
Other questions?
I have one more.
Yeah. Go ahead.
At the bottom of the 3rd page, it talks about science and social studies. And I understand that with the new test finally going operational. Is the plan next year, now that we have an operational test and we have the data, is the plan to reincorporate that into the accountability model?
That's the plan.
Okay.
So it won't affect accountability this year, because we try to get accountability as soon as the calculations are done and out, we get them out.
Right.
But because of the standard setting process and some of the other delays that we'll take, we just wouldn't be able to get accountability results in time. So it'd be for the following year.
Do you think that could, you know, looking back to several years ago when all 4 were included, do you think that could possibly help with those swings? You know, to have more data, more testing?
Yeah, yes, having more points of data would decrease the volatility some, but it's probably not the biggest contributing factor, is my guess. But yeah,
And there's more conversations I think we probably need to have. I know Mike and I've had some of those conversations around the effect size, like how certain are you that you grew a little bit, or that you fell a little bit from the standard, versus what was that magnitude of growth? I think that is part of the challenge at the district and school level with TVAS in terms of how our model currently operates. So there's some probably more examination of that we need to do that I think is probably more driving those swings, but that's my understanding at this point. Feel free to jump in if there's more.
Oh, I mean, this could be a whole long conversation itself, but I mean, happy to talk anytime if you guys have more questions on it.
I was curious, on your basic model on the first page, for your district model, you include both chronic absenteeism and absentee reduction, but that's not included in the school models.
That's correct.
Is that because it's a small number, or why did you choose that?
So my understanding of this one was when this also has to do with a historic precedent. When the accountability model was developed, it used an old district model and then built the school model kind of on top of that, and then went back and retrofitted the district again on top of the new school model. What happened in that kind of translation process is there was the accountability protocol talks about like different pathways, 3 pathways. Because that definition actually means different things in different contexts, I don't use that terminology. But it basically meant that to make the district model kind of mirror in some way some of the things in the school model, they wanted a component that was basically called value-added chronic absenteeism. To establish some kind of parallel, something to, basically through that big translation process from an old model, building a new one, then retrofitting again. Now, so I'm not fully clear as to why that metric was selected for districts and not for schools, because it is a student-specific metric. But it does, it's basically, looks like what it's trying to do is it's trying to give districts a value-added measure of chronic absenteeism. I wish I had a really good answer to that, but because it's a really good question.
I strongly believe that we ought to be measuring absenteeism, and that ought to be a factor in it, because if the kids aren't in school, they're not gonna learn. So I'm glad it's in there. And if you can get some bonus for absentee reduction, get bonus for that. I know I've looked at the absentee rate for various school districts across the state, and I will highlight Maryville School District is phenomenally low, and I've asked their superintendent, what are you doing? Because can other districts learn from what you're doing to be sure that the students are in school? So highlighting that, I think, is important. I was just curious why.
And you see the same thing for, improvement on ready graduate
Yes,
and
yeah.
transitional
Yeah.
for the EL.
Yeah. So,
2 questions I have for you, Mike. So thinking about this year being the first year that we're rolling out letter grades at the school level and the district designations, how is that going to happen and when, and what kind of communication plans? How are districts going to get that information? My first question. And then second, I know we're not making any changes this year. We've been clear about that. In the future, based on the feedback that you're gathering, can you let this group know sort of what the plan would be for making any changes? How would you go about that? What will we expect to see and hear in terms of, a timeline and process for changes in the future to the accountability system?
Yeah. So first, answer your first question, A through F. We're currently in the process of the accountability model is fairly complicated, and it makes interpreting that final letter grade challenging. So right now we are working on kind of first step educator-facing material. So basically, the people that are going to have to interface between like this technical manual and like their stakeholders and parents, teachers, whoever. And so we're working right now on getting them some tools to be able to translate, interpret, and kind of be able to speak to what's going on, as well as we'll be getting some feedback on a few maybe additional reporting. We're going to be asking a bunch of stakeholders from every region in the next few weeks. What are the kinds of things that they need to be able to internalize, operationalize, make sense of this. And then from there, we will be working on our, like a broader outreach. The letter grades would come at the same time as regular accountability determinations. They would come at the same time frame. So
That's just remind this group when that will be.
Typically August,
So late summer.
Yep.
And who are so you mentioned you were talking to some groups now to vet those. Who are those groups? Is it educators through the?
Yeah.
I think you guys have a couple different.
So
task force groups.
the upcoming group that we've got in a few weeks is our core analysts who do a lot of work with accountability in the different regions. We're working with them, and they're picking out representative people from each of the different regions and bringing them all together for us to kind of get like a big representative feedback based on the needs that we're seeing across the different regions. It's that convening is once a year. And we're using it to make sure that people have what they're equipped, what they need to have for A through F.
And then on the second question, in terms of process for future changes, how do you imagine that playing?
Yeah, we will be performing some evaluations on, as I alluded to earlier, on various components and how they interact within the system. And we will be, when we have a good sense of some of the kinks, things contributing to maybe things like swings, things contributing to maybe a letter grade that may not make sense. We will be coming up with a plan to get some stakeholder feedback and, I think we're right now still in the evaluation stage, and so if any changes were to come, we'd be communicating fairly heavily up front. We would be, looking for, feedback analysis. We want to reach out to experts. One of the trickiest things about getting stakeholder feedback with accountability with a model as complex as this is like they may give feedback on something, but not knowing how it all plays into something. If there's a system that in general, after people have had multiple professional development sessions on and still require someone to walk them through it in order to understand it, that they're evaluated on, that is not an easy thing to go to someone who is fresh and ask them for meaningful feedback and they're going to be able to give it. That's hard to do. And so when it comes to getting feedback on this, we want to make sure that we are going to be clear and help people understand the implications of the feedback that they'll be giving. So that would be, unknown date in the future. We're going to be looking through, like the issues like you brought up, we're currently evaluating, so.
No, I totally agree. I think that's part of why I'm asking, because I anticipate that any kind of changes that would be proposed to this board or other bodies on the accountability system would need a lot of like on-ramp and timeline to get people to understand the reasons for the proposal, to give feedback. And so I think, already if you're thinking about the next academic year, we're almost behind the 8 ball for any changes, in terms of the feedback that would have to be gathered in the process that you'd want to go through to make sure people kind of anticipated and understood going into the school year.
We've definitely received a lot of feedback.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So, I'm just curious more on sort of the timeline and process there, because I think, while I'm sure like any accountability system over time, changes are going to be needed and you guys are collecting that information now, the process and the timeline for which those would be rolled out is not short, generally, in terms of getting people to a place of understanding.
Yeah. And so we're working we're working to evaluate, but we're putting a lot of attention right now into making sure that people have what they need for letter grades hitting, and then we will we want to establish a culture of continuous improvement around accountability, and so helping people understand and know that like we are working to improve things, that will also be a process in and of itself.
I think the point is that it is I won't say complicated model, but complex model.
Yeah, that's more accurate, yeah.
And you're doing the right thing is that before you make any changes, be sure you get feedback from the stakeholders across the state, all stakeholders.
Yeah.
I think that's the main thing, and I think people can understand it if you walk them through it.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to speak for our chair, but I would imagine as the, Subcommittee on Testing and Accountability for the State Board, this is one avenue that you can bring some of that as you feel comfortable sharing and are sort of starting to put together plans in terms of, based on the feedback, what would make sense. We can always work with you on sort of scheduling of meetings of this group to give you another public avenue for discussing some of what you're hearing.
We're putting together some evaluations of some of these components, and we'd be happy to give you guys an overview when we finish with it. So
Please don't bring it to us expecting us to pass it without a lengthy time to evaluate it. So.
Maybe some one-on-one tutorials.
Right.
perfectly fine.
So, just to state what's already been stated, since for the last, 15 years or plus when evaluations came into place, the Achilles heel has been kind of what Nick's talking about, how it, particularly with TBOS and how it's calculated. There's probably, beats me, but a handful of people who understand that was an algorithm or whatever it is, and yet tens of thousands of people are being evaluated on something that they could not explain if they had to. And that's frustrating because you really don't know what's driving it. And until something as complex as Bob says is in such a way not to explain it, but certainly not to explain it like, well, it's complicated, don't worry your pretty little head. It's going to always be a problem. I remember there was conversations at the very beginning if TBOS was an appropriate vehicle to evaluate teachers or as a good tool to understand what's going on. And the decision was we had so much history that it would be a shame not to use it as an evaluation tool, but there was some very good arguments as to whether or not it was really valid for them. Whether it is or whether it isn't, there's always going to be some morale problems, if nothing else, on people who's getting pinged in ways that they can't figure out how in the heck that came from, you know. And until we figure out a way, and hopefully there is a way to get it to where folks, I get it now. I may not like absenteeism, don't have a clue what I'm going to do about absenteeism, but I understand it.
Yep.
TBOS is pretty.
Are we gonna get shut off the air here in a second, or? Oh, okay.
Just one last, I want to just respond quickly to Mike's comment on TBOS, and then maybe it probably is time to wrap up. But I think, you know, again, as we've seen in the educator surveys each year, teachers, as Nick was expressing, I think feel confident in TBOS because they understand how it's being used. It is a complex model. It's considered the gold standard in terms of how you calculate a teacher's impact on student growth. And I think that's one of the reasons as a state we've stayed with it. But I think where the challenge is, you know, on the district and school level, the way we're using TBOS may need to be reexamined in some of these areas so that we're not experiencing such swings. So I think my own personal sort of viewpoint on TBOS is that it's a really strong measure for how we accurately assess a teacher's impact on student growth, but how we're using it in different parts of our accountability system is where we need to really focus. And we need to continue to think about how we talk about and educate folks on TBOS. I thought Elliot did a great job with our board at the retreat recently, sort of walking through kind of how we think about the measure. But, you know, I think it's fair to say this one is complex and complicated. And I think, like I said, how we use it in our accountability system is probably something that we need to continue to look at.
Okay, any final comments before I wrap up? Well, first, let me thank Casey and Mike for coming. It's been, I think, very informative, helped us learn better what's going on in each one of these areas, and things for us to think about and things for you to think about as we continue to work together. I appreciate that. I thank our committee members, Nick and Daryl on the phone, and obviously our other board members, Mike and Lillian, participating, and again, always our outstanding state board staff for helping prepare this. I think it has been a good meeting and gives us a lot to consider as we move forward in these areas. So, thank you so much. At this time, I will adjourn the meeting.
Great, thank you.